Welcome, everybody. I'm very happy to see you all here. We have a nicely full room, deservedly so, because we have really exciting things happening here today. And I'm kind of really glad that both this lecture of Luis Eslava and the ensuing workshop are happening. Kind of all really thanks to Daniel Quiroga, who has been a driving force behind the intellectual life of the department for the years he's been with us. On and off, one has to say, kind of you've been in so many places. If we talk about place, that kind of one wasn't always sure where you were, but you were somehow everywhere. And kind of luckily, you've been able to kind of make these events here happen. So I'm particularly happy, not just because there's an event happening, because there's this event happening that really takes us into territory that we don't necessarily always cover so well here in the house. And that is, of course, history. But it's a particular type of history. It's really kind of taking a step back from the way international law has been done so far. It is interrogating very critically the way stories about international law have been told. And kind of that is, of course, in the workshop that is going to follow after the keynote lecture of Luis. Kind of you'll see this more around themes of time and place and local international, really trying to unpack some of the core notions really around which our imagination of international law has been construed for a long time. So kind of in that sense, I think kind of it really gives us a chance to sort of look at what international lawyers, international legal historians have been doing and querying, right, whether we've been on the right track, which would be a right track, and how many different tracks there are. Because, of course, one thing that, of course, critical interrogations typically tell us is that there is not just one story. There are so many stories, so many narratives, so many ways of looking at an object that we need to have in view altogether in order to understand the object properly, or at least get closer to an understanding of the object. All right. Now, I'm not going to give a long speech about this because I haven't been drafted to do that. I'm just welcoming you here on behalf of the International Law Department of the Graduate Institute. My name is Nico Krisch. I should have said this before. I'm currently head of department. I'm very happy that you're all here. I'm very happy that this workshop is happening and that Luis Eslava has agreed to give the keynote lecture starting. And I wish you all kind of a tremendous time over the next day and a half. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nico, and thank you very much again on behalf of all the support that we have received from the International Law Department. I also wanted to very quickly thank the Swiss National Science Foundation and the CUSO, the Conference of Western French-Speaking Universities, Swiss universities, for their support. It is really my pleasure then to welcome Professor Luis Eslava, who will be opening our event, but hopefully will give us plenty of material to discuss for the remaining day and a half. Luis, the floor is all yours. Muchas gracias.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Nico. Thanks, the Institute, for hosting me today. And thanks in particular to all the participants of the workshop that will follow the conversation here this early afternoon. I'm really looking forward to learning from all of the participants of the workshop. I had the pleasure of reading the submissions over the last few days, and it is an impressive body of work that is coming from all of you. And I hope what I'm going to say here today it speaks to some of the themes that we will discuss this afternoon and tomorrow, and that resonates with concerns that we will have about what's going on in international law. So I thought that there are many different ways that we can think about the political economy of representation in international legal history and how we archive or counter-archive that history. I thought that one good starting point is an announcement that came across my Instagram feed this morning in the account of, or from the account of the Justicia, which is one of the most progressive law action groups in Latin America. And this morning, based on a submission that they recently made to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, they powerfully stated, el fin del mundo ya está aquí, solo que está desigualmente distribuido. That in English would be something like, the end of the world is here, it's just badly distributed. And I think what the Justicia is inviting us to think ourselves and to the court is that we are at the end of times of sorts, but that has been always there, particularly for some people. Really, then it's a question of representation, how we understand the end of the world, how we understand who is still enjoying the benefits of what we have built together and who is paying the highest price. So to tackle this concern somehow orderly, I thought that I will divide my presentation into 4 parts. First, I want to revisit the question of representation in international law. Then I'm gonna invite us to see otherwise. 3, I'm gonna deep down into a body of work that I've been developing over the recent years with an attempt to write a book on global poverty. And then finally, I'm gonna invite you to not just see otherwise, but then try to think about what kind of counter-archive or different archive we can create of international law. So on representation. So to talk about this, again, I was thinking how we can trigger the conversation, and to start with a theoretical note from someone I love and I have learned a lot for many years. I thought that I could start quoting Michael Tausig from one of his recent books, Mastery of Non-Mastery in the Age of Meltdown. Wonderful text, especially for the followers of Tausig. And in this book, he states, towards the beginning of the book, the following: it is a dangerous moment. You feel the world tremble, and it has been like this for a while, at least since 9/11. There is no more ordinary. The whole world is living not just another era, but another culture. We cannot process what is happening, and that applies to both left and right on the political spectrum. As the end approached, the dinosaurs must have had the same problem of representational inertia. And I think for us, international lawyers or people interested in international law, or just people living in this planet, we all have a little bit of that feeling in ourselves, that we are unable any longer to represent properly what is happening. We know what's going on, so the main international institution and the main organs of international law and the main representative for international law are clearly and with one voice saying, nowhere and no one is safe in Gaza. And here I'm quoting Antonio Guterres, again, in one of the UN Instagram accounts. As you will see, my main source of information here is Instagram. He's saying it powerfully, and he's saying it clearly, and he, together with the ICJ and many other organs of the UN, are saying it. Nowhere and no one is safe in Gaza. However, there's another body of international law, not an illegal or not an external international law, but there's another international law that is saying we haven't seen that happen at this point. We have not seen them smash into Rafah. So what is the province of international law? How we can think about international law and the different modalities and lines of representation that is happening there. For that, I understanding province, and this is the dictionary term definition of it, as an area of special knowledge, interest, or responsibility. For me, the question of what is the modalities of representation in international law has to do with how we understand international law. And for me, that understanding is about the past, the present and the future. That's the province of international law. If we're interested in international law, we're interested about where it comes from, what's happening now, where it's heading, and how it's evolved on these brackets of time. But similarly, the province of international law also involves a space. What are the spaces of international law? What is the time? What are the times of international law? And finally, as someone like myself that is interested in international law from an anthropological perspective, what is the experience of international law? How people experience international law on the ground? So when we think about these different elements that form the province of international law, the area of that specialized knowledge that concern us about, and for fortune or misfortune, we work in an area that it is important for many people beyond ourselves. International law constantly, it is then trapped into a dispute about different forms of seeing or different forms of representation that compete with each other. So there is an scopic, what we'll call a scopic province. There's a way of seeing international law that compete for validities about how much accurately or not form the canon or the representational canon of the discipline. Here, representation, for what I'm going to say today, again, following the dictionary definition, is the description or the portrayal of someone or something in a particular way. And the final bit of the definition is the one that invites us to think that idea that representation is always particular, is always partial, always comes from somewhere. There is a nowhere in international law, like nowhere in any human affair. There's always a perspective. Invite us to think then that any question or any representational exercise of international law, and there are multiple, there's always a political economy behind it. Someone wins, someone loses. If you follow what I'm just saying here, and I'm fully aware that I'm being pretty abstract, and I have plenty of pictures in a moment to illustrate what I'm saying. If you're following what I'm saying, that international law is concerned about past, present, and future, space, time, and experience. Therefore, always there's a question about how we understand international law. That's a question of representation, and any question of representation is a question of political economy. The two additional problems are one, that we always talk about different forms of representation, competing forms of representation or representational variants. And second, that we are dealing here with representational justice. Okay, what kind of representation we see as the one that supports or advances what we want. So what I'm going to do next is to revisit the invitation that the Justicia was making to us, or at least was making myself on Instagram this morning, to think about the end of the world is here, but it's just badly distributed. But I want to extend that to think also historically. Perhaps the end of the world is here, or has always been here. It is just been badly distributed for a long time. Unseen otherwise. So one way in which international law tends to reaffirm itself is by containing international law in those explicitly or overtly international legal sites. One of those, one of many, one that I still find very important for us to pay attention to is the Security Council, for example. Here is the Security Council meeting that adopts Resolution 2728 earlier this year in 2024, where there was a demand on immediate ceasefire on Israel's war with Hamas. I find this a particularly important place to think about international law. And when we think about international law in those terms, there's a representation of international law in place. And I respect that, and I find it important. However, I tend to also think about the sites, the spaces, where international law is experienced, how it organizes time, so on and so forth, from other places, okay? And here is a photo of a bus stop on the border between Bogota and the neighborhood municipality Soacha, and it's where I've been doing work for the last 15 years. And my claim is that, and my invitation here, is for us to also learn that this is a site of international law. And that it's very important to do so because it helps us to question who wins and who loses in the battle of representation in international law. What I invite you here to do is to think about what normally is described as the outside and beyond as also being part of the province of international law. Why is that important? Because international law, as we all know very well, sees primarily the world through the figure of the national state. And the national state, or if you take it as a kind of the primary issue of underpinning the hegemonic scope regime of international law, when it does so, when it focus of most of its interest and perceives the world through the figure of the national state, tends to forget that in order to get to that map of neatly divided planet into 140-something chunks, there is a longer history that still have a huge amount to say about how power is maldistributed in today's world. Like Bourdieu said at the end of the 1980s, in a conversation with Roger Chartier, the present is not, therefore, the temporal present. It is what is still sufficiently alive to be the object of struggles. What international law does, when overemphasizing the national state and the independence of the formal independence of national states, particularly post-colonial states, is to make a break between the past and the present, sidelining histories of empire and how empire is still with us. My claim, however, is that if you take empire seriously, and histories of empire seriously, like anything in the global, anyone in the global south, I think will be able to deny, international law is rather just only confined to places like the Security Council. There is an everywhereness of international law. An everywhereness of international law. So what are the key things to attack in the hegemonic representational forms of international law, if you want to put it into a programmatic fashion? One is the state centrism that continues to occupy international legal thinking. When we do that, we put into question traditional definitions between or conceptualization of international law as being only occupied or only interested in what we identify as the international, leaving everything else to the domestic legal orders and institutions, exculpating the international and blaming the national, for example. The other second element to question is what I will call the immediatism, which is different to the presentism, the immediatism of international legal thinking, to try to focus on today and leaving aside the yesterday. In so doing, if we question immediatism in international law, we put a break into sidelining the past from the present, and instead, like Bourdieu was inviting us to do, see that the past is still present, but it's still the object of our struggles. And in so doing, obviously will make the near and the far distinction collapse in itself. If imperial relations that happened in the past that were organized under a logic of center-periphery, if the past is not past but is present, that center-periphery relations continue to be here. And in order to understand the periphery, you have to still take into account the metropole. The next item in our programmatic agenda of questioning hegemonic ideas of international law will be logocentrism, or the idea that law and life are separated. And like many social legal scholars and critical legal thinkers and feminist international lawyers have said, that separation needs to break down because life is informed by law, and law definitely is full of life. And finally, two other items in my programmatic agenda to question the scopic hegemonic regimes of international law is these two last ones, what I will call the agentic centrism of international law, and finally, the victim centrism, meaning that international law tend to operate on the basis of some people having agency, others not, and some people being fully victims and others saviors. If we do that, in my view, we will be able to break the back of a distinction that, as you will see in my work on poverty, is quite important. There's a distinction between pleasure and misery, or salvation and poverty. What I want to do then, if you put it into the language of Griffith Jones, is to invite us to think how there's always a massive presence of the past and the foreign, the external, the other, in the constitution of the local present. In order to do that in my own work, I try to shift the way in which normally we see the operation of international law, tending to only focus in these overtly sites of international law, like the Security Council, abandoning the bird view of international law, and Annalise Riles will put it, and instead adopting an ants view of the world, getting down and dirty with the world that international law has built over the least 500 years. On poverty. So there is a news that have been circulating over the last couple of decades about the actually well-proven fact that we are towards the end of poverty at a planetary level. And this is a news that we must celebrate. We must celebrate. But however, the way this news is often reported, and people has come to understand it, needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. Yes, indeed, we are towards the end of poverty, but first caveat, it has been a specific miracle. It has been a specific miracle. And the miracle is called China. If you take China out of the global equation of lifting people out of poverty, and here is the statistics for 2007, when the measure was still $1 per day. If you take China out of the global equation, every single region across the planet has more or less remained the same in terms of number of people living in extreme poverty, which is connected to the second caveat. That the news that, as you saw, is announced with so much celebration, The Economist, the cover that I just showed you, it is also a partial success. It's not just only that China has been the one doing the main lifting work here, in terms of lifting people out of poverty, but when you look at the global distribution of poverty, yes, indeed, as you see in the red banner at the bottom of the graph, we have been eliminating poverty, but poverty understood as extreme poverty, which in the graph of 2007 of the World Bank that I showed before was measured back then in terms of $1 per day. Today, that has been updated to $2.15 per day. Okay, that's the success. Now, it's a partial success because what has happened over the previous decades is that most of the population in the world today are trapped just above the extreme poverty line. If you take $10 per day as a measure, which is the band marked by the light blue at the top of the graph, If you try to make an assessment of who lives in poverty using that $10 per day, around 65% of the global population are trapped there, below that line. And that line is important because the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, all of them have confirmed that we need at least $10 per day to live a dignified life in the 21st century. Again, it is a partial success because, yes, we have been eliminating extreme poverty in this planet, but the large majority of the world population lives just above the extreme poverty line. Now, it is also the contextualized achievement. That's the third problem. As the world has lifted in China, people out of extreme poverty systematically, the maldistribution of wealth have increased at the same pace or even at a higher pace, at a faster pace. This is work coming as a graph coming from the work of Jason Hickel, a very famous economist / anthropologist, that have insisted very powerfully that over the last 70 years, if you take as the parting point of the graph, the end of the Second World War, what we have seen is how the global north have tended to accumulate increasingly more of the share of the global GDP pie, meaning that today we live in the most unequal moment in the history of this planet when you think about the global north and global south divide, which is a very complicated, but I'm just asking you to trust me on the use of those terms for the purpose of what I'm saying here. So basically what I'm saying here is, yes, we have been eliminating extreme poverty. That has been done by China. It's only extreme poverty. But on the top of that, the distance between the ones that have and the have-nots is increasing. And this is creating instability, to say the least, in this planet in a systematic fashion. And the fourth and final problem, it is that, yes, we have been lifting people out of poverty, but this is a blind accomplishment because this has been happening, okay, as privatization of public services have become the norm. And this has been happening for the last easily 30 years or so. Deindustrialization is here to stay, both in the global north and the global south, thanks to, or as a result of another thing that is not mentioned when we celebrate the end of poverty, that is the idea, the process of automation of productive activities, which means increasingly less jobs. All of this coupled with the financialization of the global economy, meaning that there is really no production needed in order for the GDP pie to keep growing. Financialization, one of the beautiful things that it does is that create wealth without labor, with very little labor. And finally, all of this is happening within the context of the climate crisis. Many anthropologists and sociologists and demographers and political economists have said that when you take these issues into account, yes, we have been eliminating some forms of poverty, but really the main mechanism to lift people systematically out of poverty, not just extreme poverty, but that just living above the poverty line sort of poverty, is no longer here. And that has been come to be defined as the end of the working man or the working woman. The figure that so far has helped us in this long process of modernity, in which we are still embarked, to lift people out of poverty, okay, to generate development. The New Yorker summarized this for the global North audience, which is a phenomenon. It's the end of the working man or the working woman is happening both in the global North and the global South, by the way. The New Yorker summarized it in this cartoon, and I think it put it pretty well for everyone to understand. So I'm starting a startup that helps other startups start up, okay? Basically, what the New Yorker is invited here to consider is those jobs that are being created now are temporal. They actually are not engaged in a process of production in which they increasingly more labor required, are based in speculation and gambles on risk. Many of them obviously collapsing by the very nature of the enterprise. If you have, we're around 8 billion people now in this planet, and according to the World Bank, we all have to be entrepreneurs. Okay, so by the mere fact of that kind of invitation, the omen of entrepreneurship is that a large chunk will collapse. So then, what is the challenge posed by this new nature of global poverty? And I think the challenges are two, at least. Challenge one is that we have an old form of poverty that we came to understand as absence that continue to mark our policies and shape our imagination about poverty and international law, when in reality, we should be aware that there are new forms of poverty emerging, characterized by precarity, that we are not actually able to respond to because our representational regime, the scopic regime of international law, is still unable to capture it. Challenge two, that behind this is a really complex of transformation of the international legal order that so far we have understood in a sort of fragmented way. So in public international law, we have moved from a concern in the second half of the 20th century with the idea of affirming the sovereignty of countries, when at some point we became concerned, our main objective, at least as international lawyers, was to create a system of interdependence. In international human rights law, we moved from an understanding of international human rights law and the main functions of human rights as being grounded on social rights, the right to self-determination being one of them, as many critical international human rights law scholars have said, to a system where what is aim is to protect individual rights, and in international economic law, a system that what aimed to foster was the modernization of economies, national economies, through, in many occasions, policies like import substitution, industrialization strategies, to a system today that is grounded on the usual suspects, free trade, so on and so forth. I'm just using here neoliberalism as the logics of international economic law today. And it is in this interaction between these different corners of the international legal order and the transformation, okay, where we see a large world of the global population living just above the poverty line. And unlike the dinosaurs, when they saw the end of the world coming, we don't have much tools to talk about that reality, to represent it. Okay, final bit on archiving otherwise. So basically what I've been inviting you over the last sections is to shift the ways in which we see international law, to question hegemonic scopist regimes of international law that disable us to respond to reality. And for me, the realities that I'm more concerned about within the context of my work on global poverty is that if we don't question traditional forms of representation of the poor in international law, we will continue to legitimize a regime of preferences and certain naturalized transitions that continue to be part of the way in which saving the poor continue to predominate in international legal thinking. When I'm thinking about a regime of preferences, it seems like this, okay? A regime of preferences that says that the poor live in the informal world, survive in the informal economy, and the purpose of international law, in whichever form and shape, is to make them more formal and official, transform the other into citizens, the female into the masculine, the low income and the middle income into high income, the rural world into the urban, or what I will call the techno-service industrial economy, the unsustainable into the sustainable, and those that live in misery, bring them into the realm of joy. It's a regime of preferences because prefers in the binary the second. And the idea is that law execute that transition. And law naturalize that transition. An example, last year the World Bank conducted the annual meetings in Marrakesh. And when the meetings were about to happen, again, in the Instagram World Bank account, I was invited to take part of a couple, and the millions of people that follow the World Bank. I don't know if the million, but I think the few hundreds of people that follow the World Bank on Instagram. We were invited to take part of a couple of activities, outreach activities organized by the bank. And the first of these activities happening actually the first day of the meetings was a workshop entitled A New Playbook for Challenging Times, taking place on October 10 at 9:30 a.m. GMT. And not surprisingly, the marketing department of the World Bank decided to use as the subject of, to illustrate who was going to be saved by this new playbook, a racialized girl, seemingly poor, living in misery, a victim, an ideal victim, someone who had to be saved urgently. Follow that meeting or that outreach activity, there was a second one taking place now at 11:30 the same day, GMT. Now, the second meeting was called Job-Rich Growth, the Answer to Poverty. And here, the image change, the regime of preferences takes place, and instead of having a racialized girl, apparently based in Africa, now we have a person with full exercise of the agentic powers in front of a computer, enjoying her maybe latte, not in a plastic cup, but in a reusable cup. So perhaps you think that I'm just inventing this and then just pulling something out of the marketing department to creating a scarecrow. However, it is very true, and it continues to be the case, that one solution continues to be seen and endorsed as the solution to save the problems of the world. So here we have Javier Milei, now again, from the Instagram Financial Times account, being quoted saying, you don't get out of poverty by magic. You get out of poverty with capitalism, savings, and hard work. So what I've done over the last many years, trying to understand poverty and think about how I can think about it in a different way, and how I can find a way to not just replicating this scopic regime that I've been critiquing here. I have come again and again to face that indeed there is a wall out there, that it is in very precarious conditions, and it's in very precarious conditions because of the way which international law has come to make them. So in an interview in 2022, last year, in April, a couple of years ago, sorry, we're already in 2024. This is the problem of academics, and we take so long to actually do our research and write. So in an interview with the son of one of the siblings of a family that I have been following for at least 10 years or more. He's now 24 years. I asked him how was his economic situation, and he said, things are pretty tough. I work for a gelatin factory that sells gelatin products, in local stores. And I don't have a permanent contract. I just earn depending on how much I sell. And before the pandemic, things weren't going well. However, after the pandemic, raw materials have been becoming more expensive. Therefore, my gelatin products are more expensive. And all of this happening because those raw materials come from China, and now distribution channels are complicated. So basically, he said and summarized the situation as, I have less income and I have to work more. The problem was that in addition to just keep working more and earning less, is that before the pandemic, he had bought a motorbike that was starting to need repairs. And then those repairs, the parts to do the repair, were also coming from China and were getting more expensive. So he had invested the money to buy those parts instead of paying the debt, which was now increasing, and he was now about to lose his motorbike on the top of being on the brink of losing his job. All of this happening when the owner continued to spend all of his weekends at his holiday house in a nearby town in Bogota. So here we can see my informant telling me, yes, I have a job. Surely, therefore, he is not one of those living in extreme poverty. He has been lifted out of extreme poverty, but his life is extremely precarious. And so on the basis of that, misery and sustainability, low income, all of those side of the regime of preference will be applying. However, it took me a long time to realize that every time that over the last 10 years, I have been visiting this family, when they tell me all of these difficult stories about their life, they always welcome me with a massive meal. And it took me a long time to understand that even though they was always reporting about hardship, they were refusing to be subsumed within that side of the bracket, or that side of the binary, that I was mentioning before. And it took me, therefore, a long time to understand. Now we're being, as one of them once told me in different words, but here, just put in a sharper way, being done and undone while resisting. And it is on that basis that I was forced to start rereading the canon and approaches to poverty, particularly within the Latin American context. And there I had to revisit the work of Oscar Paz-Bora, the founding father of sociology and anthropology in Colombia, who in the 1950s and 1960s took the task of going and interviewing fishermen and fisherwomen in the northern part of Colombia. He wanted to understand them, and in order to understand them, he felt that he had to spend time there. Perhaps what I was trying to do, or I've been trying to do for the 10 years. He did a better job. And what he discovered there is that these men and women fishermen, they define themselves as women and men, territorial women and men. And what that meant, being territorial women or mujeres or hombres icotea is the Spanish name for the kind of territories in that area of Colombia, is that they were used to, and they had to get used to survive both in water and land, because it's a prone flooding area. Would make the life very precarious if they wouldn't adapt. They were always adapting, so they were like turtles, being able to survive in both environments. But also on the top of that, they knew that only thinking was not helpful in such environment. They also have to feel. And they could not just live in misery all their life. They have to combine joy and struggle. And in so doing, in a much more kind of theoretical, bourgeois language, they were breaking the back with all of those moves, break the back between agency and structure, and most importantly, this world and other worlds in which they also existed. In a book that later Oscar Paz-Bora published on the basis of that fieldwork, he came to quote one of these fishermen and fisherwomen that he interviewed, these hombres y mujeres icotea. And I'm just about to close. They are in really beautiful, amazing book. He quotes one of his informants saying, look, pay attention. coping with life is not the same as suffering. Here, as you see me, I'm not bitter or complaining. We're still able to laugh, to enjoy life, to have sex, to get into a fight, to tell rich people off. We still know how to resist and how to run away. Remember, turtles also know how to scratch and how to bite. And when they get you in the jaws, they never let you go. So my argument, if I have an argument here, or at least my invitation, is to spend time with people on the ground, trying to understand how they exist and how they respond to this very difficult world. And perhaps there, we will start thinking about a different international law that, by the way, is already here. I didn't touch more on it in my kind of formal time. But let's use Donna Haraway to close this first part of the meeting. And this is Donna Haraway in Staying with the Trouble, Making King in the Chatulusi, published in 2016, a book that has indeed many problems like Donna Haraway herself, but has lots of wisdom, in particular, I feel, for international lawyers today when we are concerned about how we think about discipline and other ways of thinking about it. She said, opening the book, we all in terror live in disturbing times, mixed-up times, troubling times, and turbulent times. So what to do next? To become capable with each other in all of our bunches kinds of response. This task is to make kind in lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning to live and die well with each other in a thick present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. I will now make some general comments just to start the conversation, but I really wanted to remind you that all of you in person, but also those online, are being invited to raise your questions. Would you join me here, Luis? Thank you very much. I have to start, of course, with apologies. The fact that Professor Luis Eslava requires no introduction is no excuse for me not to have, of course, introduced him. Professor Luis Eslava has not only been, now for the second time, a visiting professor here at the Institute teaching international law in the Global South, but is now also currently affiliated with Kent Law School and the University of La Trobe in Australia. And Luis, I just have a couple of general questions that I think can open up vistas to a conversation. The first one is that maybe I don't want to trust you with your use of Global South and Global North. Luis, to me and to many others in this room, has been a towering mentor in what is called roughly the third world approaches to international law. But from time to time, at least I, as a twailer, as that acronym is used, get questions if twale or third world is really still a useful analytical category to think and work with. The same, of course, happens all the time with Global South. And I was just wondering, maybe we can talk a little bit on the kind of politics of region making and the kind of logics behind it. Right now, with some colleagues from what is also very ambiguously called Eastern and Central Europe, I've been very concerned or very interested in thinking about what the second world means. So that would be an interesting point to start a conversation, as many of the papers really of the workshop really engage head on with this question. So what does it mean to be a region in the world? The second question, just inspired by your extensive use of Instagram and pictures, relates to the maybe what we can call the task of curating. No, all of the images you shared, those were highly curated, as my own proper Instagram is. And of course, there will be an Instagram picture of this conference in due time. And in all of them, in a way, it was official institutions doing the curating. It was the World Bank. It was maybe major press outlets. So I was just trying to in line with what you told us or your invitation to think otherwise. How can people from below or turtle men and turtle women also engage in perhaps what you would call counter-curating or curating otherwise? The third kind of break point I had, and reminds me of some of the conversations we were having in the last workshop last year, some of you are repeated offenders in this, thank you for coming again, was all about aesthetics. And one of the interesting parts of that conversation was to, as you said, push back against logocentrism and the kind of affiliation of law with reason, with a kind of impersonal, objective way of thinking things. And seeing that you invoke quite often and very productively Orlando Falsborda work, I was just thinking that he famously, in the Colombian context, used the expression sentí pensar. No, this could be translated, maybe it's been translated as thinking, feeling. I think that's the best English translation. So a way to kind of push against this dichotomy of the emotional and the rational, let's say the passional and the serious. And I would like just to try to link that work with some of the work that some colleagues here at the Institute are doing regarding emotions and international law. So how can we bring that conversations about the passionate, the sensuous, into a field of our vision? And maybe the last question is that I really found beautiful how you shared your field notes. Also quite an intimate thing to do. I wouldn't dare to show my archival notes. It was wonderful because we saw some of the struggles that you're doing and you're engaging with as you're struggling. No, we have bilingual notes, English here, Spanish there, paintings, drawings, tensions, quotes, and many kind of difficulties. So just because you've been leading a lot of the work on ethnography and anthropology and international law, and because we have plenty of PhD students who might be engaged in also doing this kind of work, engaging in interviews, in field work, in extensive ethnographies, I'd just be curious if you would be willing to open your field notes even further to tell us more about your experiences in the quote-unquote field. I'll stop here so we can have a broader conversation. I would suggest that you maybe take a stab at whatever you find interesting there. And then I really look forward to opening the floor. Thank you, Luis.
Yeah. Thank you. That wonderful questions. I want to say something that, well, let's see if I can say something quickly about the 4 points that you make, starting with the Global South. There is a problem. There's a problem with the Global South, and I think that the problem with the Global South is that it exists. There's a half factuality out there that is telling us, for example, through the work of Jason Hickel, that regardless all of the epistemic uneasiness that we have with the label Global South, as before we had it with the idea of the third world, it exists. It exists, perhaps not in a clean way, perhaps not in a kind of pristine form, but it exists. There is a resilient maldistribution of global wealth across the planet. There's some outliers of that kind of who were originally brought under the banner of the Global South. For example, you have South Korea and you have countries in the Middle East that have escaped the Global South, but largely we continue to see exactly the same maldistribution, and not only wealth, but productive power that can only be to be reaffirmed with, for example, the way global value chains have kind of make more complex patterns of production across the planet, but in terms of wealth, maldistribution remains pretty much the same. So I think that's actually the problem of the Global South, that it exists, or at least there's a reality, a factual reality out there that continue to push us to find ways to describe what's out there. And some people try to come with other rubrics in order to talk about that reality. Others, a bit more recalcitrant like myself, would say, well, I like to use the Global South, or even I want to think about them as the third world. And here comes the ideological baggage. And it's ideological, and I think it's ideological and political, because when people like myself continue to use Global South and the third world, we want to think about the long making of the present world. And in order to do that, invoking things like the Global South or the third world is a way of reminding ourselves that we come from somewhere with provisos and with lots of careful thinking. I just finished teaching this course on, and I see some of my students here on international law and development, Global South perspectives. And then we had a really productive conversation about the limitations, but also the enormous value of the Global South. So the point about counter-hegemonic is an excellent one. My intention was to give you some examples, and the example that I want to bring you in this talk. Didn't have time to do it. It was going to be too long, my talk. It's an initiative sponsored by several archivists from the Global South, many of them based in Latin America, that have been trying to respond collectively to horrendous things that happens in the world of memory in terms of the fragmentations of political archives. So one thing that has been happening recently in the context of Latin America, many other Global South countries, is that for the previous many decades, artists / political activists have been extremely productive in generating a body of work that today the art world see in a huge value. And so what has happened over the recent years, and this is a very recent development, is that when these artists / political activists die, and often without having made a lot of money during their lifetime because they have been working for the right cause, then the art community arrives and then fragments those archives, buying the things that they consider art, pulling apart from all of the activist political work. And then there are a few examples quite well documented in Latin America where this has happened. Okay, so there's very little memory that is being archived or counter-archived in the sense of these very political progressive bodies of knowledge at the moment. So these collectivities have been trying to put together a sort of protocol, some guidelines to protect those political archives. But there's plenty of examples like that. So efforts to create another record of what has happened. And this is extremely important because there are going to be other ways of knowing in the future if we don't preserve, those counter-archive or counter-memories. It's been well known that, the history that we remember is the one that have been produced by the one that was sitting next to the cannon. And this is, it's no surprise for anyone. So counter-archiving is extremely important, especially for people like us that are now living out of being worried about knowledge. The question of logocentrism is an interesting one. So how we escape the written word and the authority assigned to the written word, particularly when we are lawyers. And that basically has been my preoccupation all along. And the reason why I insist in doing fieldwork and trying to understand how the logocentric world ended up shaping us in conversation with the broad reality. The beautiful thing is that that's not my own preoccupation. Many people in this room share it, and many people have shared it in the social sciences and the humanities for a long time. So one of the authors that I mentioned here today, and Daniel was referring to, is Orlando Fowles-Border. And some of his work has been translated into English. Particularly, he's the founding father of participatory action research. But that's kind of the pop side of his work. The more intellectual, fine-tuned, graphically oriented work is marvelous. And he deployed all of his intellectual abilities and efforts into generating a system on a body of knowledge that was able to account to different forms of social life. This book that I was quoting here from today is called The Double History of the Caribbean Coast of Colombia. And it's a double history. It's a 4 volumes book. It's a double history because each page has 2 phases, the side A and the side B. And on the left, you have how he encountered reality from his fieldwork and listening to music and having roundtables with people in communities about all sorts of elements of social lives in the Caribbean coast of Latin America. And on the side B is all the official sources and how history has been officially told. And it runs for 4 volumes. So imagine the investment, the human investment in trying to still unable to escape logocentrism, to try other ways of giving account of reality. And And I would like to see also that in international law. And when I at least see what I try to do, it goes in that direction. And how you can expand the way you understand the world, is still being respectful of international law, although that doesn't mean that many international lawyers consider me an international lawyer, but that's another issue. And so the fieldwork notes, I mean, the fieldwork notes reflect that exactly. So the fieldwork notes reflect the fact that when you go out there and try to understand social life as it comes to you, it doesn't come to you in a neatly fashion. It comes to you in a messy fashion. Part of the reason why, the other day someone asked me, why you have all of those drawings in your fieldwork notes? They're really nice. I said, no, they're by any means nice. I ended up drawing is because when I'm in a conversation, if you start taking notes, direct notes, verbatim notes of your conversation, people feel actually that you're putting them on record and people feel uncomfortable. So what do? What I learn to do is either when people are talking to me, I draw something for me to later to remember, or as soon as I finish a conversation, I go to a corner and then draw something quickly. I'm not claiming any artistic value here, no any kind of intrinsic value of what I do. I just simply making the point of if we really are in the business of trying to understand what international law is doing, just to be precise, out there, it is not possible just to confine with traditional ways of giving an account of international law, because you will tend to get trapped into those scopic regimes that I was critiquing today. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Luis. I'm sure you're giving all of them plenty of stuff to draw after this conversation. Now, I wanted to thank Silvia Nissen from the Global Governance Center, who very kindly passed the microphone around the room, but has been indispensable in the organizing of this whole workshop. Thank you, Silvia. Silvia, I think Farsad had his hand up, and please raise your hands and I'll give the word. Again, the same to those online, please. Oh, maybe just introduce yourself for the purpose of everyone in the room.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Luis. I've had the pleasure, and I still do, that I'm your student. I really enjoy your work because it's highly political and divisive. But I want to poke you a little, if you don't mind. Not physically, of course, but I don't think we're that close yet. Either way, and we've had this conversation before. I think it was last year when you did the International Law Colloquium here. I asked you a similar question, but looking at it through the prism of what you presented here so brilliantly and inspiringly. And connected to one of the points raised by Daniel on Global South, 12, etc. I take issue with it maybe from another angle. Perhaps I would share that situation, positionality of being a bit global South-ish and so on, or I don't know, global South-South-ish, depending on how you see it. But putting aside the numbers and figures, economic articulations of the divide, global North and South, I'm fine with that. But in the ideological operation of the notion, more often than not, I sense that there is a form of self-certification in it, in a moral way, which is interesting, of course, but as an object of study, perhaps. My approach to it is a dose of skepticism. That in this self-certification, moral certification, more often than not, what happens is a brand of self-orientalizing. I'm just borrowing the word from Said. I don't like his work. I think it was wrong. But nonetheless, in that self-orientalizing, what's left at the end as the surplus enjoyment is that we're better. Question is, then what? Then who? How? Why? Building on that, what follows, in my view, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I would appreciate it if you disagree with me, is that by doing this so that we somehow, in a paradoxical way, elevate ourselves, first of all, in an attempt to pick one subjecthood under international law over another one, in the sense that that self-branding, self-representation carries with it some residue or components of us being indigenous subjects, as a notion in international law, where at the same time we also might be pressing for another form of subjecthood, which is statehood. Take Palestine, take Kurdistan, etc., X, Y, Z. And again, through that paradoxical operation, we fall, I mean, when I say we, don't take that at face value. We fall into another paradoxical situation of, first and foremost, attaining some level of self-agency by that self-portrayal of us as the perfect victims. That it is through imperialism, colonialism, and that sort of thing, whereas our hidden gems could have been distributed and offered to the world, we just didn't get the chance to do so. And that sort of essentialism, I mean, I went a long way. I see it as incorporated into the genetics of the notion of global South, twirl, and that sort of thing. What happens in operational terms, I take the case of Kurdistan, with which I'm a bit more familiar, and I will cut short, is that in the case of Kurdistan, at least there are some people or some groups who try to exchange and barter the immediate oppressor for a future oppressor. Who's the immediate one? It's your cousin or the intelligence service office in your town and so on. You push against it by resorting to the language of international human rights law, self-determination, etc., etc. You elevate the discussion like that to create a sort of buffer. Provided that you're successful, you're going to face the future monster oppressor, which is the international institutions, the other states, etc., etc. That was to maybe depict an image of impossibility, bordering cynicism, as to, yes, maybe the thesis is oppressive, etc., etc. There could be room to think that actually the antithesis that some are putting forward is, if not equally, but to some extent, oppressive. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Prasad. He will be presenting in tomorrow's roundtable in case anyone wants to book him instead. Further. Before we go to Juan Diego, I just wanted to give the word to Catherine McNeely. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, we can, but maybe we can turn on the volume just a little bit. Thank you, Silvia. Wonderful, Catherine. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you for that fantastic and really stimulating keynote. I was really interested in the discussion of the hegemonic representation of immediatism in international law, which I think is a real pertinent issue at the moment. I wonder how it might link to issues of speed in your analysis. So how do you see and approach the issue of crisis, of urgency, and perhaps a binary between urgency and slowness in international law as this links into your thoughts on immediatism? So how do we, I guess, engage with this particular representation of speed in your thinking and through that practice of archiving otherwise? Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. And maybe one last question for this round. Would that be okay, Luis?
Yeah.
Juan Diego, you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Juan Diego Di Mate. I'm from the University of Seoul. I'm a PhD in law. I'm presenting tomorrow. Thank you, Daniel, for the organizing this wonderful event and Luis for the presentation. My question is more straightforward, and I wonder, what do you think about the idea of neoliberalism ending, or that neoliberalism has ended, as some have argued recently, and if this is convenient for us, if it's not? Because as you were mentioning, the global value of change have changed dramatically, and this is related to the industrialization, automatization, financialization, all this stuff, where this idea that neoliberalism was meant just privatization and of public services and all this kind of evaluated or questioned. So I wonder, what are your thoughts of this? Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Diego. Luis?
Thank you. Wow, that was a lot. Let me start with the neoliberalism one. I think there's part of that the literature out there saying that neoliberalism has ended, I would think that it's just too optimistic, and it doesn't, particularly making the fall of, like, again, dividing the past and the present. I think that many of the neoliberal hardcore neoliberal reforms of the 1990s are still, alive in the global south today. I mean, there's just no question about that. However, what is true is that the functioning of economies in many developing countries has changed, and in particular changed dramatically as a result of the pandemic. And there's a sort of kind of the formation of a new welfare state in developing countries that is actually quite interesting to pay attention to. And I think in order to properly assess the emergence of that incipient form of new welfare state in the developing countries, you need to question traditional understandings of poverty and traditional understanding of development. So what I have in mind here, and here I'm just drawing topics for future doctoral projects, and there are things that I'm trying to think through for my work on global poverty, are things like conditional cash transfers that began in Brazil many years ago and have kind of expanded and mutated and become really almost entire networks of welfare provision in developing countries. There's also really interesting debates about the establishments of national systems of care in developing countries that is really breaking, it escapes all traditional ways about thinking about welfare. There's also new job schemes in developing countries, and all of these bits and pieces, policies that I just mentioned, mount to something different to the traditional understanding of these countries as subject through and through of neoliberal policies. So it had changed, and that's good. What is emerging, we haven't understood it properly yet, but there are many residues of hardcore neoliberal policies continues there. If someone is interested on this, one of the most kind of interesting writers on the transformation of neoliberalism in Latin America, the part of the world that I know best, her name is Verónica Gago. She's a feminist economist, is based in Argentina, engaged in a frontal attack to Milei's policies. But she's the kind of the most interesting and sharp mind behind new thinking about neoliberalism. And one of the things that she says is that paradoxically, neoliberalism subjects, the ones that initially opposed to it in the 1990s and the early 2000s, are now the ones, the carriers of neoliberalism. So another side that we need to understand, especially from an international law point of view, because people in the social sciences and feminist economics, they have done it. So the question of urgency of crisis is really interesting. When I was thinking about the immediacy of international law, like many things in international law, that international law focuses on immediacy doesn't mean necessarily that responds in an immediate way. Often, similarly, when international law, traditional accounts of international law says that, or the way it is imagined is that only exists in the Security Council or in The Hague or here in Geneva. But most of the work of international law is conducted in very localized places, very, very discrete places. So immediacy is there, marking understandings of international law, but that, however, doesn't mean that international law response or international institutions respond in an immediate way. And then I think that paradox is interesting to unpack. And to the difficult point about self-certification and that we are better when people use third world or global south, I agree. It's a process of self-certification. But what I would say is self-certification on the face of empire. And one, and two, when that certification takes place, doesn't necessarily extend, as I think you were suggesting, the same logics of empire. It can do, but it doesn't necessarily need to do it. And there are plenty of examples of that. On the self-certification side of things, Rose Parfit, in a chapter that she wrote for a book on Bandung that I had the fortune of co-edit a few years ago, she drew attention of how, when you go and revisit the archive of Bandung, when many of the countries that participated in Bandung, by the way, people that are not aware of it, it's a conference that took place in 1955 and was the first non-white international conference. And I mean, when you go and revisit the archive, many of the things that the interventions that were made in the context of the conference basically ratify this idea that these post-colonial countries, newly decolonized countries, were the newer and the truer subjects of international law. And the reason for that is that, fair enough, they were saying, well, we're newer, but we're truer to international law because we are respecting international law. What we have in front of us is the Soviet Union and the US engaged in a nuclear war. Then it will just disappear the planet. I applaud that. I applaud that process of certification, newer and truer. Good on you. Now, on the point of that, the logics are not extended. I think one of the things that came out, for example, of the Third World Experience was, yes, indeed, the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s, replete of Third World dictators, nasty pieces, okay? From Pinochet to entire cadres of horrible Maoist guerrillas doing really horrible things in Peru, thinking again back in Latin America. But at the same time, the Third World as a movement generated a huge amount of poetry, alternative cinema, music, networks of academics moving around. It managed to do alternative policies, create a nascent middle class in the Third World that then was wiped out by neoliberal reforms in the 1990s and the 2000s. So being the new and the truer, I applaud that. In occasion is necessary. It's a political act. We're talking here about politics. And secondly, then you are the new and the true, and that you affirm yourself like that. It doesn't need to, you're going to follow the logics of empire necessarily. Yeah.
Necessarily. Thank you very much, Liz. Now I would like to give the floor to Manuela. Marcia online also raised her hand. Sohail, sorry.
Okay, I think I have 10 questions, but I'll try to dispose one of them. I remembered something while talking to Andre earlier. There is this quote on the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiro de Castro that questions the idea of the subject, the poor, when talking about the indigenous people. And he says that for the state, it is necessary to turn the Indian into the poor so it can finally become a subject of not only public policies, but also the whole framework of the functioning of law and so on. So that's a question I would pose. Who would be the subject, you know, the poor for you or to whom you are making reference? And the other thing is, you mentioned this fiction of the end of the working man, but in the story that you told about the family that you were visiting, I think something that becomes clear is the idea of time as well. There is this person who can enjoy time somehow, and then in a position, the one that needs to work in a position of spending time doing something else. So I think the other question would be, how would you perceive time in this construction, also the subject, you know, the poor, in other terms than the income or wealth and so on. So I think that's all.
Thank you, Manuela. I would like now to call Marcia. Can you hear us?
Marcia? Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear
us?
You can also see me.
Good to see you again.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I have a question, maybe a follow-up question to Catherine. in terms of maybe more slow international law or immediate international law. And I'm thinking of an article that I read 1 million times for my PhD thesis. That is the Hilary Charlesworth article on international law in times of crisis, where she's saying, well, why certain aspect of international law, and then she mentions, of course, global poverty, access to basic sanitation, but also HIV and so forth, are so marginalized. And then what I was very impressed in your presentation was the use of all your Instagram posts. So I was wondering, maybe you have some ideas on the role of media in all of that, because I think somehow it's a very part of this discussion. Thank you
Wonderful.
so much. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Marcia. Now turning to Sohail.
Yeah, thank you very much for this great presentation. And so my question is more about the idea of ethnography, as you mentioned, and the way that, let's say, so there's this kind of an probably epistemic challenge always in a discipline is that, for example, when you're doing an ethnography of Venice or Amsterdam or Paris, it's kind of considered as being more related to international law. When you go to somewhere else, and it's sort of there's an uneasy feeling that are you really doing something or writing something about international law? So there's this bias that we can always see. So my question was that to what extent do you think this could actually address this sort of uneasiness people might have when they are basically doing ethnographies or writing histories of peripheral, basically, locations in international law, but at the same time, not falling into the trap of Eurocentrism, because sometimes we tend to kind of make it closer to the familiar minds of the disciplinary imagination, to using the categories that, let's say, we have all over the discipline. And however, many of those categories are also the products of the European originated international law. And to what extent can we, do you think this can be addressed, actually, so in order without falling into the trap of Eurocentrism?
Thank you very much. So there's a couple of people, but I'll suggest to do another round, please.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. So the charge, and I'm gonna put it in a chapa from what you just challenged me about is whether when I go, or people trying to do the kind of work that I do, when we go to a peripheral place, we will end up being kind of a benevolent imperialist in the sense of extending international law to those places, because we ended up reading those realities that could be complex or otherwise within or through the lenses of international law. And I think that's absolutely correct. I think that's been that'll be one of my silent preoccupations for a long time. And I think I could only manage to address it, and I haven't done it properly, but I could only manage to address it now I'm here. I'm not saying this for the purpose of theatrics, but it was interesting that I've been doing this work on poverty for many years, and I kept going to the same family, asking questions, spending time with them, having those meals, and always trying to just reread it through a very narrow lens. And it took me years to realize, to make sense of that zigzagging between, yes, the world is fucked, but we're still enjoying here, and we're still, extend our generosity to you, and let's have fun. And let's to put it all in one, all at the same package. It was very hard, and I think just now I'm starting to get a handle of it. And so I hope someone was going to make me ask me a question about the dinosaurs. But what I was reading at Tausig's, that book by Tausig, I really felt like the dinosaurs. So for a long time, I have been seeing the world collapse of sorts, and I didn't have a framework of representation there ready to understand as part of the same package. And I think it comes precisely from what you just said. So thank you. I think the point about the media is a good one. Part of why I use so much of Instagram is it is actually quite interesting to see how international institutions self-represent themselves and how active they are in these platforms. But I'm not a media person. I just thought that for the purpose of thinking about representation and the political economic representation, I thought it was very helpful to tap into that source. The substantive point, if I can make one, is that representations matter a huge amount. So how we understand the world, how we understand international law, it is mediated by media, and it has a huge power. And so there is a war being fought in Gaza at the moment, and that war has been heavily mediatized, and global responses to it, good and bad, have been mediated by those representations. Most of them going through Instagram, TikTok, and others. But there is one of the wars that is being fought at the moment is on that platform. And the global imagination of the generation to come is being shaped through that. Yesterday, for the first time, I saw, for example, that my 16 years old start posting things in supporting Palestine. And I promise I was not pushing the line on him, but I was interesting to see how he, by his own means, went and then kind of joined the media global campaign for it. But this is not new, no? So when international law, so if you take early Spanish colonial presence in Latin America, for example, as a part of kind of the predecessor of modern contemporary international law, one of the things that the Spanish tried to do in the Americas was to establish a casta system, which was basically a class system based on racial interaction. So if you were, a Spanish from the peninsula married with a Spanish, you continue to be white. But if you marry with an indigenous person, you were mestizo. And if you were a Spanish and you marry with a black African slave, you had, and then there was a whole casta system, and there are drawings of the casta system that you can see in the Mexican National Museum. And it had a huge amount of power in order to shape the sociological imagination of the early colonial period. And it still have a massive impact today when many countries in Latin America self-describe themselves as mestizo, and mestizo came out of the categories of the casta system. So representations are very important. And who will be the poor of international law? I think that goes back to the question about extending empire to places. And I'm with Vivero Castro in two senses. One is that the very kind of Foucauldian point, like in order to turn a subject into a manageable subject, you have to bring them into a category of management. So you cannot deal with indigenous people. You can deal with somehow through the manipulating free, pre, and income consent, but as indigenous people are pretty difficult to manage. But if you approach them as poor, easy peasy. Much easier to advance the welfare system, state presence, so on and so forth. I mean, that's the history of Australia for a long time. Now, I'm also with Vivero Castro in the sense that there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in order to turn things around. So not to think about how international law thinks about the poor, but how they describe poor, think about international law and how they experience it. And that reversal is really complicated. And I think that's one of the challenges that international law is having today because of the crisis of legitimacy that is happening. So how people are actually experiencing international law, it is a huge concern. And it's interesting. So when you go and visit how vocal Guterres, the General Secretary of the United Nations, is today, I think he's engaged in that battle, the battle of legitimacy. You hadn't seen, or at least as far as I remember, a General Secretary being so outspoken to the global public. And I think part of it is that battle. It's a kind of a Vivero Castro battle that he's fighting.
Thank you, Luis. So in principle, we should be wrapping up, but there were a couple of questions and I wouldn't like not to have the opportunity to hear them. So what I suggested, that's fine with you, Luis, is that we should listen to the questions, but then maybe your response will take other forms throughout the workshop. But that way we can collect the maximum amount of questions. So shall we begin with Fuad in the back or maybe Andre? Okay, we'll follow the order. So Andre, perfect. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. It's been a very, very interesting presentation. So my question actually builds up on what Manuela and our colleagues said about the self-certification on the Global South, who's the poor. And what I wanted to know from you is, to what extent do you think that every time we talk about the conditions under which, for instance, we examine the political economy of international legal history nowadays, we must not now perhaps interact and articulate better the local histories themselves, right? In order to identify which subjects can and perhaps should define themselves eventually as the third world or as the poor. To proceed a little bit with what you just mentioned, one of the propositions of Vidas Castro is reversion, right? Because I'm thinking about when you mentioned the whole increasing of inequality at a global level. When we dig deep into, for instance, what happens in many of these other countries considered the third world, the inequality in these countries has also deepened brutally. And many in, say, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, are living off as a life that is much closer to what we call is the global north, for instance, right, than what is effectively the global south. And they don't see themselves effectively, perhaps, as the global south in these countries, but they perform this global southness outside, right? Because I find that interesting for the purposes of resistance, of the concept of resistance. Who, for instance, the effective south of the global south, as the colleague said, are actually resisting against. My mind comes, for example, Manuel mentioned the indigenous peoples. So the various illegal miners in the border with Brazil, Venezuela, who was in many ways supported by the state by means of deregulating, these minings. The big companies, which are actually, say, Brazilian or South American, like Vale or Braskem, that effectively are, so to say, members of the global capital and effectively impact the lives of these people locally, right? So my question is, how do we articulate these stories? And is it, in that case, possible to think of any international legal history that doesn't do local history and local legal history effectively? So.
Thank you. So shall we do maybe Fuad, Aurelia, and Lorna, and we come full circle? So maybe, and if you could raise your hand, Fuad, just, and then we'll come Aurelia and Lorna. And
thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel, for putting together this wonderful event. And many thanks, Luis. Fascinating presentation. A lot of food for thought. I have one question about the terminology of field work you used. And it was fascinating to see your field notes, by the way, research in action in a way. So I was wondering whether you would have used the field work terminology if you had done work, for instance, I'm not sure whether there are fishermen in Amsterdam. Maybe they are, I don't know. Or you would have called them, the work you would have called it survey or interviews. The reason why I'm asking this, we have a colleague here in history department, Mahmoud Mohamedou, who teaches a wonderful course, you may know him, the international history of racism. And he makes this wonderful point that we always talk about field work when it's happening in global north, the south. And he tells this anecdote of a Lebanese friend who was annoyed to get this question constantly, whether he had done field work, and his response was, I was bored in the field. So I would be curious to hear, if you had done some interviews in Vienna or Amsterdam or The Hague, you would have called it field work or interviews or surveys?
thank you, Fuad. Aurelie?
Hello, so thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Luis, for this very inspiring presentation. So I'm very simplifying, but my understanding is that we're questioning representation. And you mentioned a few challenges perhaps my idea is to develop further to support the change of representations. So what would you identify as the main elements that are preventing from evolving from the actual representation that is currently used in international law? And also for effectively impacting on a change in international law. So to rephrase also is, what would it require to apply the representation you propose in international?
Wonderful. Last but not least question, Lorna.
Thank you for your brilliant talk. I really enjoyed the imagery and the Instagrams and everything that brings things into life. I think that's really good. So my question is about your categorization of poverty. So you begin by saying that the old poverty is characterized by absence. And I assume you mean of wealth, of access to justice, of everything that we take for granted here. And that new poverty you describe as a kind of precarity, and this I recognise. But what I was wondering in terms of my own narrow field of research was, do you equate the new precarity with a disenfranchisement of access to justice, and even of a kind of blindness, really, to issues which do affect people within themselves, like there are international law issues such as territory. So does the territory of law exclude people who are in a precarious situation?
Thank you, Lorna. So, Luisa, I was reminded that we had a last-minute cancellation on the first panel, so I suggest that maybe we take some of that time for you to respond to the questions, if that's fine.
Thank you. I need to. I was kind of relaxing.
Of course.
Thank you. So it's a trap. It's good. Thank you. So so the question, the first question about the Andres question about the importance of paying attention to local history, and I'm paying attention. Following that, pay attention to the maldistribution of resources and income, GDP per capita within countries in the global south. And I say, yes, absolutely, both cases are important. However, my worry is that there is a quite bounded understanding of the local and a quite state-centric understanding of maldistribution internally. So my, I suppose, provocation and invitation / provocation is to try to understand the local and the national as part of larger global processes. And this is why it is important to the Bourdieu's point about, what is past, what is present, and complicating that is extremely important. That doesn't necessarily mean that every single agentic act in the local is subsumed into the larger global processes, and that any indigenous community today is part of a globalized world, and therefore the traditional knowledge are all just wiped out by the tide of modernity. No, definitely a lot of that is still there, but they pretty much structured by the structures that were set in motion many years ago. So I remember a few years ago, I was in a panel with an UN expert of indigenous peoples, and I was trying to make the similar point, and their response was, well, I've worked for decades with indigenous peoples in the Amazons, and they don't care about the state. Your story is incorrect. I said, but it's precisely the point. You don't need to care about the state for the state to condition your reality. I mean, the very fact that you're still an indigenous people, you are trapped either in Brazil or Venezuela or Colombia or Ecuador or Peru, each of them sharing a chunk of the Amazon. You don't need to know about that. That is the point about nature today. The more that human will out there is being segmented and conditioned by structures that they didn't participate in creating. So I think that's the challenge. Maybe that's the challenge of global history, but it's also been the challenge for a long time of global administrative law and people paying attention to regime interaction and how law is being produced in many multiple ways. Because the point being there is that you cannot use these pro forma categories in order to understand what's happening. And this is not just you get that insight from very deep fieldwork. It's just a cursory look on reality. The minimal use of empirical sense already tells you that there's just not such a thing as local. There is no such a thing as a Brazilian maldistribution of resources. I mean, it's a global maldistribution of resources that have plenty of phases where you go. And the drivers, by the way, are uncannily similar across the board. So fieldwork in Amsterdam. I suppose you can't, I mean, I think.
Or in Geneva, by the way.
Well, in Geneva. So expensive to do fieldwork in Geneva. I think I'm just being here conservative in the sense that I'm saying fieldwork because I have spent 15 years just looking at the same thing again and again and again. And it took me 15 years to realize that the soup that they were giving me was also, I should have taken them into consideration and pay respect to that as part of my research findings. So, yeah, but I take your point that is this still that sense that you do fieldwork in the third world, that you do fieldwork in the global south, you do fieldwork in the native you know, Luis does fieldwork in poor neighborhoods around Bogota or different parts of Colombia. There is that sense that that there's still the frontiers of humankind that we need to pay attention to. But the other day, for example, someone was saying, you know, given that you are writing a book about global poverty, why instead of doing fieldwork with poor communities that we have over-researched them, why don't you go do fieldwork with rich people? That they are the actual problem. The question about other representations is excellent. So the question is how the kind of representation that I'm offering congeals and helps to execute change. I would like to say that it's just the world is waiting for my book. but I think that those representations are already there. So I feel I'm speaking in this space to a scholarly audience, where I think what I'm saying is still not being articulated. I'm trying to fill a gap of knowledge and then see if I can get a book contract out of it. But I think when you go out and when I do interview with public policy makers in Colombia, where this book is based, they themselves are advancing a different representation of the role of Colombia in the promotion of development. And then many of these states have been doing it for a long time now. So globally today, there have been a long discussion about the limitations of the extreme poverty line as a measure of poverty. And now we use the language of the multidimensional poverty index. And that again, is another metrics and but that was designed within national departments of planning in Latin America, because they wanted to push a different reality and come up with different sort of measures, because they're not going to win with the traditional GDP per capita, because this country is never going to produce a GDP per capita that will be enough to reverse long-term trends in poverty and encroachment. So what they had to do is come up with a different way of measuring poverty in order to accrue resources in a way that will be more effective and trying to track more accurately the efforts. So basically what I'm trying to say is there, the challenge is more us, right? The challenge is whether we are prepared to accept those alternative readings, valid readings. And this is what some of these countries are fighting for. So I mentioned, and this is a feminist cause, really important one, the establishment of national systems of care. It's extremely important. Why is it important? Because many women in the global north, but mostly in the global south, continue to be the ones doing most of the care work. Surprise, surprise. And many of these women, surprise, surprise, get old. And when they get old, they have overwork all their lives and they don't have pensions. And that's a massive and spoken drama. Countries in the Global South have been trying to establish national systems of care. But in order to do that, you need to prove to the IMF that having a pension system that covers everyone, including those women that do most of the reproductive work, is part of the economic function of nations. And that's an issue of representation. So, the fight is there and the fight being fought. The question is, understanding that as part of our concerns. And I forgot the last one.
Well, maybe.
Sorry,
Do you want to restate it in a second, Lorna, or should we take it over?
No. I think I was.
Poverty.
Sorry. The question the question about access to justice, about precarity. Yes, I would say that it's precisely that. When I have here in mind the question of absence, is that the way poverty came to be understood, and this is the heyday of McNamara as a president of the World Bank, when the World Bank launched a war against poverty was very much imagined in the extreme poverty sense, okay? And that was the target. People didn't have clothing, housing, education, drinking water, so on and so forth. And what has happened as the global economy has grown is that many of those issues, for example, think about clothing, have been solved just by the mere trickle-down effect of so many clothes being produced planetarily over the last X number of years. But the issue now is precarity, okay? And there's kind of that level quality services that today people receive for their levels quality good and people enjoy. And that's why people remain trapped in that 65% living just above the poverty line. And one of those is the quality of justice. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. I don't know if the whole world is waiting for your book, Luis, but I for sure I'm one of them. I wanted to thank you again for this wonderful way to start our conversation. All of you, not only for being here, and staying 15 minutes over, I really appreciate that, but really for being here in this very difficult, busy, and rather hot times.